My husband shouted, "You hid $300,000 from me," in front of our daughter. I felt my heart split, but I didn't argue. I'd already moved the money to a private account under our kids' names. It was for our future, I whispered. He grabbed his keys and left that night. 2 days later, his mother called, voice trembling, "Lena, you need to sit down. Something's happened to Ethan." If this story touched your heart or made you think about trust and family, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Tell me in the comments, what would you have done in my place? And where are you watching from tonight? My name's Lena, I'm 25, and if you'd met me a year ago, you'd have thought I had it all figured out. A stable job as a medical assistant, a sweet little 4-year-old daughter, and a husband, Ethan, 31, who everyone thought was hardworking and dependable. To the outside world, we looked like the picture of a young, struggling but happy family. But behind our front door, things weren't what they seemed. Ethan had always been controlling with money. From the beginning, he wanted separate bank accounts. "It's just easier, Lena," he'd said when we got married. "You handle yours, I'll handle mine. Less drama." I didn't argue back then because I thought he was being responsible. Turns out, it wasn't about responsibility, it was about control. He made more than I did, yet somehow I was always the one covering groceries, daycare, and bills he forgot to pay. When I'd bring it up, he'd laugh it off, saying, "You're better with numbers anyway." And I'd swallow my frustration, telling myself it was just how marriages worked: compromise, patience, teamwork. But let me tell you, teamwork doesn't look like one person holding everything together while the other plays video games till 3 a.m. When I got pregnant with our first child, that's when his true colors started showing. He'd mock me for gaining weight, tell me I was too sensitive, and roll his eyes whenever I asked for help around the house. I'd be crying on the bathroom floor, exhausted, while he sat in the living room with his headset on, yelling at his friends through his console. After our daughter was born, it got worse. He'd come home, open a beer, and complain about how loud the baby was. He never helped with night feedings. When I asked him to, he said, "You're the mom, that's your job." I'll never forget that. Those words burned. Still, I forgave him again and again. We even went to counseling once, and for a while, I thought he was changing. He'd hold my hand, promise to do better, and for a few months, I believed him. I always believed him. Then one day, I found out he'd opened 3 credit cards in both our names without telling me and maxed them out. I remember the room spinning when I saw the statements. When I confronted him, he just shrugged. "Relax, I'll pay it off. You worry too much." But he didn't. He lied. Over and over. I could have pressed charges. The credit repair company said so. But I didn't. I paid them off myself, telling myself love meant forgiveness. I thought if I was patient enough, he'd see how much I was sacrificing. Maybe he'd finally appreciate me. He never did. Fast forward to last year, he got injured at work. Fell off a loading dock, hurt his back bad. 3 months out of work, no savings, no insurance to cover the gap. I was 5 months pregnant with our second child, working part-time, barely sleeping. The bills were stacking higher than I could handle. Credit card minimums, rent, groceries, my student loan. It felt like drowning, and he just sat on the couch all day, playing games and complaining about pain. I don't doubt he was hurt, but emotionally, he checked out completely. Some nights, I'd cry quietly so our daughter wouldn't hear, wondering how much longer I could keep going. I'd wake up early, pack her lunch, kiss her forehead, and pretend everything was fine. But deep down, I was breaking. Then one afternoon, out of nowhere, I got a call from someone I hadn't heard from in months, Aunt Margaret, my father's older sister. She sounded warm, almost nostalgic. "Lena, sweetheart," she said, "I was thinking about you. How about lunch tomorrow? My treat." I hesitated because, truthfully, she and my dad hadn't spoken in years, and I hadn't seen her since Grandma's funeral. But something in her tone made me say yes. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was hope that someone, anyone, still cared enough to ask how I was doing. I didn't know it then, but that one lunch meeting would change everything. It would become the turning point, the spark that lit a fire I could never put out again. Because what Aunt Margaret was about to hand me, across that quiet cafe table, wasn't just a check, it was freedom. It was power. And it would expose the truth about Ethan in ways I never saw coming. I still remember that day like it just happened. The soft hum of the cafe's air conditioner, the smell of coffee and buttered toast, and the way Aunt Margaret looked at me with eyes that somehow saw everything I'd been hiding. She was my dad's older sister, a woman who'd always carried herself with quiet strength, the kind of person who didn't say much, but when she did, you listened. I hadn't seen her in months, not since our grandmother's funeral, and, to be honest, I didn't even know why she wanted to meet me. So, when she smiled and said, "Lena, I've been thinking about you lately," I felt my chest tighten because no one had said that to me in a long time. She asked about my job, my daughter, and the baby on the way. I told her the truth, that things had been hard since Ethan's injury, that money was tight, but we were managing. She nodded, sipping her coffee like she knew I was lying through my teeth. Then, without a word, she reached into her purse and slid an envelope across the table. I frowned, confused. "What's this?" I asked. She smiled faintly. "Just open it, sweetheart." Inside was a check. My eyes blurred for a second because I thought I'd misread the zeros. But I hadn't. It said $300,000. I swear my breath caught in my throat. "Aunt Margaret, this has to be a mistake," I stammered. She shook her head softly. "No mistake. I sold your grandmother's house. It was time. She wanted you to have something, Lena. You were the only one who actually showed up for them when they needed help. The others, well, they didn't." She sighed, eyes distant. "I promised myself that when the house sold, I'd split it. Half for me, half for you. But this stays between us. Your father and brother don't need to know. Promise me that." I sat there frozen, tears welling up, not even knowing how to thank her. She reached across the table, took my hand, and said gently, "You've carried more than your share, Lena. Now you get to breathe again." That check felt like oxygen after years of drowning. When it cleared a week later, I sat at the kitchen table surrounded by bills, calculators, and debt statements, feeling a mixture of disbelief and determination. Ethan was still out of work, lying on the couch with an ice pack on his back, scrolling through his phone while the TV played some mindless show. I didn't tell him the amount. I just said, "My aunt helped us out a little." He didn't even look up. "Cool," he muttered, "make sure rent's paid." That's when I knew I was doing the right thing, because if I told him, he'd burn through it in a month. So, I started quietly fixing everything. One by one, I paid off our debts, the credit cards he'd maxed out, the personal loans, the student balance I'd been dragging for years, and the car loan that always seemed like it would never end. I even paid back the relatives who'd lent us money when we were desperate. In total, nearly $120,000 gone, and for the first time, I felt light. Next, I opened a savings account and put $20,000 aside for our daughter's future, promising myself I'd do the same for the baby once he arrived. I still had a large chunk left, enough to finally feel safe, stable, like maybe I could breathe without checking my bank balance every morning. But I didn't tell Ethan. I told myself it wasn't a lie, just protection. After all, he'd made it clear our finances were separate. He always said, "What's yours is yours, what's mine is mine." So why should this be different? A few weeks later, strange things started happening. Ethan got a letter in the mail from a credit bureau, a notice about improved scores. He looked puzzled, flipping it in his hands. "Weird," he muttered. "I didn't even make any payments." Then another came, confirming a closed account. "What the hell?" he said, glancing over at me. I shrugged, keeping my tone casual. My aunt helped a bit. I paid off some things. His eyebrows shot up. "Some things? Like what?" I smiled softly, just that's. "Don't worry about it." That should have been the end of it. But Ethan, he couldn't let it go. Over the next few days, he started asking questions, small ones at first. "How much did she give you exactly? Was it a loan or a gift? Do I need to pay her back?" I tried to dodge them gently. "It doesn't matter, Ethan. What matters is we're finally free of all that stress." But the more I deflected, the colder he became. One night, as I was folding laundry, he snapped, "You think I'm stupid? I can tell when you're hiding something." I froze, staring at him. "I'm not hiding anything, Ethan. I just don't think it's something you need to stress about right now." He gave me this hard look, the kind that made my stomach twist. "Right. Because I'm just the dumb husband who doesn't need to know what's going on, huh?" He stormed off, muttering under his breath. I told myself he'd calm down, that he was just frustrated being home and bored. But deep down, a part of me knew the truth. He was angry because the control had shifted. For once, he wasn't the one holding the power. The next morning, I woke up and something felt off. My purse was on the kitchen counter, unzipped. My debit card was missing. My heart dropped. I rushed to the bedroom, but Ethan was gone. His phone charger, his wallet, all missing. My hands trembled as I tried calling him. No answer. I called again. Straight to voicemail. Then it hit me like a punch. He'd taken my card. I drove to the nearest ATM, my pulse pounding so hard I thought I might faint. When I inserted my backup card, the receipt printed, and that's when I saw it. A withdrawal of $200 at 7:13 a.m. That wasn't the problem. The problem was that he now knew. The ATM screen had probably shown him the balance, the full amount left from my aunt's check. Every dollar of it. I felt sick. I drove home shaking, my mind racing with what he'd say, what he'd do. He came back that evening, slamming the door so hard the picture frame in the hallway fell. $300,000, he shouted, his voice shaking with rage. "You hid that from me?" I stood frozen, my daughter's toys scattered at my feet. "You stole my card?" I shot back. "You went through my things?" "You lied to me," he yelled, veins bulging on his neck. "You plan to keep it all for yourself." "Ethan, it was a gift. My aunt gave it to me because I took care of my grandparents. It wasn't ours, it was mine." His face twisted. "Mine? Oh, so now I'm just some outsider in my own marriage." He started pacing, his hands clenched. "You think you're smarter than me? That you can hide money and make me look like a fool?" I wanted to scream that I'd paid off his debts too. That everything I'd done was to protect our family. But he wasn't listening. "You know what?" he spat. "Maybe your aunt should have given it to someone who actually deserved it." And then, just like that, he grabbed his keys and stormed out again. When the door slammed shut, the apartment went eerily quiet. My daughter peeked out from her room, her eyes wide. "Mommy," she whispered. I forced a shaky smile. "It's okay, baby. Go back to bed." But inside, I was crumbling. Because I knew this wasn't just a fight. This was something breaking, something that couldn't be repaired. That night, I changed my debit card number, updated my online banking, and froze every shared account. I didn't sleep. I just sat there in the dark, the glow from my laptop reflecting off my tears. I told myself I'd deal with the fallout in the morning. But as dawn crept through the curtains, I realized something chilling. The real betrayal wasn't that he took my card. It was that, deep down, I wasn't even surprised he did. When Ethan slammed the door that night, I felt the whole apartment rattle, and in that instant, everything we'd held together for years began to show its cracks in full daylight. He stood there in the hallway, face flushed, breath ragged, shouting, $300,000. "You hid that from me." And I remember how small I felt under the weight of his anger, even though I'd paid off every credit card he'd opened in both our names. "You went through my purse?" I asked, voice thin, because he had, and he looked at me like I'd committed some unforgivable crime. "You lied to me," he spat, and the words cut into me like glass, because I'd been trying to protect us, to keep us from collapsing under the debts he'd buried us in. And before I could explain, he shoved past me into the living room, grabbed his jacket, and said, "I can't be with someone who hides things. I can't be here," and then he was gone. The front door slamming so hard it left a ringing silence that swallowed the apartment whole. Our daughter peeked around the bedroom door and whispered, "Mommy," and I breathed. "It's okay." Though inside my hands were trembling as if I'd run a mile. I changed my debit card that night, updated passwords, froze accounts, because I knew Ethan's history, how quickly he'd spend on video games, booze, and weed, how he'd pull money from anywhere if he thought. It was his right, but when he texted his mom that evening saying he'd left because he felt trapped, I felt something cold settle in my chest. The next morning she called me, voice gentler than I expected. He's with me for a while, and I heard no support in it. Only the echo of a son choosing escape over responsibility, which stung sharper than any insult. The whole neighborhood seemed to hold its breath while I sat at my kitchen table, the envelopes I'd just paid tucked into a folder like small, brittle papers of proof that I'd tried to save us, and for hours I replayed every long night he'd spent gaming, every time he dismissed my exhaustion during our first pregnancy, every time I'd forgiven him because I thought love meant endurance. When I finally called the divorce attorney Jenna, my friend from college who'd turned blunt and practical after 2 rough divorces of her own, she listened, then said, "If Aunt Margaret's check was a gift to you, legally that money's yours. He can try to claim half, but it's not likely to stick if you keep records. We should act fast to protect the kids and your share," and I felt steadier hearing it, like the first firm hand to grab me after being adrift for months. But even with legal ground beneath my feet, my hands shook as I told Jenna everything. About the hidden credit cards, about the night I paid off debts, about Ethan taking my debit card, and about how he'd stormed out saying I'd been hiding money from him. She said we could file for custody, that the courts often saw who was the primary caretaker. And hearing that felt like a kind of permission to stop pretending this was salvageable for the sake of a promise that had long been broken. That afternoon I boxed his things not in rage, but with a mechanical calm, the dozen pairs of headphones he'd thrown in a shoebox, the game console still sticky with spilled soda, his favorite hoodie I'd washed twice, but which carried the smell of nights spent away from us, and I labeled the boxes because control felt like the only currency I had left. Then I called a courier and had everything shipped to his mother's address. When Ethan came back that evening to collect a phone charger, he hesitated in the doorway, looking smaller than I remembered, and said, "We can talk about this." And I said, "There's nothing left to talk about if you feel trapped by marriage and kids," and he told me, quietly, in a voice I barely recognized, "I never wanted children, I never wanted this life," and the words landed like a verdict. He told his mother the same, and she'd helped him buy a plane ticket to stay with her instead of asking him to come home and fix things. The betrayal wasn't dramatic in that moment. It was ordinary, and that ordinariness was worse because it revealed who he was when there were no friends or therapists to make him look good. Still, people outside our walls asked questions, neighbors, distant relatives, and Ethan, I later learned, was telling them I'd hidden money, that I'd betrayed him, painting himself as the wronged party. Which made me sick because I'd spent that $120,000 wiping away the debts he'd created and repaying the very people he'd borrowed from, and yet his story framed him as the victim. I could have chased him, begged him to stay. I could have stood on some street corner with a sign that read, "Please don't go," but instead I chose to be methodical. I removed my name from any shared accounts. I transferred $30,000 into a savings fund for our children, set aside $50,000 for a down payment, and I blocked his number for a night when he started calling friends to badmouth me, because if I let the narrative of our marriage be written by his version of events, I'd lose not only peace but maybe custody leverage later. And when he finally signed an agreement through his lawyer offering $3,000 for a used car and asking to forfeit visitation in exchange for minimal child support, I felt a cold clarity wash through me. I remember thinking how quiet the apartment felt afterwards. How our daughter didn't cry or call for daddy. When I told her he was gone, she simply went back to her crayons, and that small indifference told me everything I needed. He'd never been the father I hoped he'd be. And maybe that realization hurt more than any betrayal, because it meant I'd been grieving a man who never existed. Still, the cliff wasn't closed. His threats of claiming a share, the possibility of relatives stirring trouble, and the jagged ache of betrayal left me raw and unsettled. So I did something small that night that felt enormous. I called Aunt Margaret, told her what happened, and she said, quietly but firmly, "You did right, Lena. Keep your head. Protect those children." And as I hung up, I realized the real battle wasn't the money anymore. It was for my future, for the safety of my kids, and for myself. I had to decide what kind of life I wanted to build out of the mess he left. And that decision would change everything. But before I could make the final moves, I needed one more thing. The court papers, Jenna's signature, the filing date, the promise that this wouldn't just be an argument that faded into another sleepless night. And as I sat on the floor by the nursery, rocking my daughter to sleep, I whispered to her, "Mommy's going to make sure you're safe." And I told myself I would, though I didn't yet know exactly how the final scene would play out. The morning I signed the divorce papers, I remember my hands didn't shake for the first time in years. They were steady, like my body finally understood that the war was over. The courthouse smelled faintly of coffee and old paper, and when the clerk handed me the stamped documents, I stood there a second too long, staring at my name printed above Ethan's, realizing how much of myself I'd lost in that pairing. He didn't show up, of course. His lawyer delivered everything. He'd already moved in with his mother, and rumor had it he was telling people I'd taken everything. The irony almost made me laugh. Everything I'd taken was what he'd already broken. A week later, his mother called, voice flat, saying, "Ethan's fine. He's starting over." I told her, calmly, "So am I." That silence between us was heavier than any argument we ever had. By then, I'd already opened a new account in my name only, transferred the remaining money, and finalized the funds for our children, $30,000 saved for their education, locked under accounts only I could access. Another $50,000 marked for a future home. I'd kept every receipt, every bank statement, every text message where he'd admitted taking my card. Jenna, my attorney friend, said I'd built an airtight wall around myself, and I smiled because that's exactly what I needed, a wall. A safe one. The birth of my son came 2 months later, quiet and gentle, nothing like the chaos that had defined my last pregnancy. My mother stayed by my side through labor, holding my hand, whispering, "You're free now, baby." And I believed her. When I looked into my newborn's eyes, I didn't see fear or uncertainty anymore. I saw a new beginning. But freedom doesn't erase memories. Some nights, when the house was silent and both kids were asleep, I'd remember Ethan's words, "I never wanted this life," and they'd still sting. Yet the pain didn't control me anymore. It just reminded me why I left. I started journaling every night, writing down the small victories, paid off another loan, cooked dinner without crying, laughed with Mom over coffee. I was rebuilding myself in pieces. Then one evening, Ethan texted. Just one line, "Can we talk?" I stared at it for a long time before replying about what. He said, "I want to see the kids." I didn't answer right away. I called Jenna, who reminded me that he'd legally forfeited visitation rights. "You don't owe him access," she said. "If you let him in, make sure it's on your terms." Still, part of me wanted closure. So, I agreed to meet him at a cafe, public, neutral ground. When he walked in, I barely recognized him. The confident man I once loved looked hollow, older, like guilt had worn him down. He sat across from me, fidgeting with his coffee cup, and finally said, "I'm sorry, Lena. For everything. I was stupid." His voice cracked, and for a moment, I saw the boy I fell in love with, not the man who destroyed our marriage. But forgiveness is complicated. I told him, "You didn't just hurt me, Ethan. You hurt our kids. You left when they needed you most." He looked down, tears in his eyes, whispering, "I wasn't ready to be a father." I nodded, calm but firm. "That's why I'm the one raising them." And when he asked if I'd ever take him back, I said, without hesitation, "No. You made your choice. Now I'm making mine." He didn't argue. He just nodded, stood up, and left. Watching him walk away felt like closing a book I'd read too many times, familiar, painful, but finally finished. After that meeting, something inside me shifted. I stopped seeing myself as a victim. I stopped apologizing for surviving. Aunt Margaret called a week later, checking in, her voice full of pride. "Your grandmother would have been so proud of you," she said, and I smiled through tears. I told her about the house I was looking at, small, 2 bedrooms, a yard where my daughter could play and my son could learn to walk. It wasn't big, but it was mine. She offered to help with the down payment, but I refused. "You already gave me enough," I said. Now I want to do the rest on my own." She laughed softly. "That's the Lena I knew you'd become." The day I moved into that little house, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: peace. My mother stood beside me, holding my son, while my daughter ran from room to room yelling, "This one's mine." I hung a framed photo of the three of us by the kitchen door, and beneath it, I taped a small note to myself: "You survived what was meant to destroy you." That night, after putting the kids to bed, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea and watched the sky fade from pink to dark blue. The world was quiet. No shouting, no slammed doors, no fear of what tomorrow might bring. Just me breathing, free, alive. But here's the truth no one tells you about freedom. It doesn't arrive with fireworks. It's quiet. It's calm. It's sitting in silence and realizing you don't need anyone's approval anymore. I used to think revenge meant making Ethan see what he lost, but now I know better. The real revenge is happiness, peace, stability, and the kind of love that doesn't demand you shrink to fit someone else's comfort. My children will grow up watching their mother rebuild from ashes, and maybe one day, when they're old enough, I'll tell them the full story, not to make them hate their father, but to teach them that sometimes choosing peace is the boldest act of rebellion there is.